I thought I married the same man for 12 years, but one night, something so small happened that it changed everything I believed about my life. It wasn't loud or dramatic, nothing anyone else would notice, but it stayed with me in a way I couldn't explain. The man sleeping beside me that night looked exactly like my husband, sounded like him, moved like him, but something inside me kept whispering that he wasn't. At first, I tried to ignore it, because how do you question something that impossible without questioning your own sanity? But the more I paid attention, the more that quiet feeling grew stronger. And by the time I realized what was truly wrong, it was already too late to pretend I hadn't seen it. There's something people don't tell you about marriage, and it's the part that makes stories like this even more terrifying. It's not the big moments that define a relationship, not the anniversaries or the memories everyone talks about, but the small things that no one else would ever notice. The way your partner says your name when they're tired, the way they pause before answering certain questions, the rhythm of their breathing when they sleep. After 12 years, you don't just know those things. You absorb them without trying. They become so familiar that even the smallest change feels out of place. And that's exactly why what I noticed didn't feel like imagination, because it wasn't something new, it was something missing. It started with his voice, not the sound itself, but the way he used it. My husband had always spoken effortlessly, like his words came naturally without any effort. But now there was a pause before he responded, just a second longer than usual. It was so small that anyone else would have missed it, but I didn't. It felt like he was thinking too carefully before speaking, like he was choosing his words instead of letting them come naturally. I told myself it was stress. Maybe work had been difficult lately. Maybe he was just tired. But even as I tried to explain it away, something inside me refused to settle. Because it didn't feel like stress. It felt like someone trying to get something right. I remember sitting across from him one evening, watching him without making it obvious. Everything about him looked the same, the way his fingers wrapped around his cup, the way he blinked slowly when he listened, the way he nodded slightly before responding. Nothing was wrong, and yet everything felt off. It was the strangest feeling. Oh, like looking at a perfect copy of something you know too well. That was the moment I realized my discomfort wasn't coming from what I could see, but from what I could feel. And that feeling didn't go away, no matter how many times I told myself I was overthinking it. If anything, it only grew stronger the longer I stayed quiet. Then he said my name, and that was the first moment that truly unsettled me. He had always said it in a certain way, soft and familiar, like it carried meaning beyond just a word. But that night, it sounded different, shorter, and slightly colder, like something was missing from it. It wasn't wrong, just unfamiliar in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't react, I didn't question it, because I didn't even know how to begin that conversation. Instead, I kept it to myself, like everything else I had noticed so far. But something had already shifted in my mind, something I couldn't undo no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The next change was something I couldn't explain away so easily. My husband hated drinking coffee at night. He had said it so many times over the years that it became part of who he was. He would always avoid it, always choose something else, always complain about how it affected his sleep. But suddenly he started making coffee every night at the same time, sitting quietly and drinking it without saying a word. The first time, I thought nothing of it, but when it happened again and again, I started paying closer attention. It wasn't just the coffee, it was the way he drank it, like someone repeating a habit they didn't fully understand. The more I watched him, the more I noticed things that didn't feel right. The way he sat was slightly different, a little straighter than usual, like he was aware of his posture. The way he laughed came a second too late, like he was reacting instead of feeling it. Even the way he walked had changed, just slightly slower, just enough for me to notice. None of it was obvious on its own, but together, it created a pattern I couldn't ignore. It felt like I was watching someone trying to be my husband instead of someone who actually was him. And once that thought entered my mind, it refused to leave. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that stress or routine changes could explain everything I was seeing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something else happening, something I didn't understand yet, but could feel getting closer to the surface. That's when I decided to test something only my husband would know without thinking. It was a simple question, something casual enough to seem normal, but meaningful enough to reveal the truth. I didn't expect the answer to change everything, but the moment he responded, I realized I had crossed a line I couldn't go back from. I asked him if he remembered our honeymoon in Santorini, and as soon as I said it, I watched his face carefully. He smiled immediately, almost too quickly, and answered with complete confidence. He said the beach was beautiful, and that was the moment everything inside me went still, because there were no beaches where we stayed, not even close. We had spent our entire trip on the cliffs, surrounded by white buildings and endless views of the sea below. It was one of our most important memories, something he would never get wrong. And yet, he said it so naturally, like he truly believed it. I waited for him to correct himself, to laugh or realize what he had said, but he didn't. He just looked at me calmly, like everything he said was completely normal. That was the moment fear replaced doubt. Because it wasn't just that he gave the wrong answer, it was how certain he was about it. If he had hesitated, I could have convinced myself it was a mistake, but he didn't hesitate at all. It was like he was remembering something that never happened, and that thought stayed with me long after the conversation ended. That was the moment I stopped trying to explain things away. That night, I couldn't sleep, no matter how hard I tried. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, every word, every expression, every detail that felt out of place. The man beside me slept peacefully, completely unaware of the storm building inside my mind. I watched him for a long time, trying to convince myself that everything was normal, that I was overthinking it. But the more I watched him, the more that quiet feeling returned, stronger than before. And somewhere between doubt and fear, I made a decision I had never imagined making before. I stayed awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling while my thoughts refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again, heard his voice, replayed that moment when he answered the question about Santorini with complete certainty. It didn't feel like a mistake, and that was what scared me the most. Mistakes come with hesitation, confusion, something that gives them away, but there was none of that in him. He sounded sure, comfortable. Yeah, almost like he had lived that memory himself. That thought kept circling in my mind, over and over again, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. And somewhere in that quiet darkness, I realized I needed proof, something real that could either confirm my fears or prove that I was losing my mind. I turned my head slowly and looked at him as he slept, his face calm and familiar under the dim light. Everything about him looked exactly the same, and that made it even harder to accept what I was feeling. I told myself one last time that I was overthinking, that I should just go to sleep and forget about it in the morning. But my body refused to move, and my mind refused to let it go. Instead, I reached out slowly, carefully, making sure not to wake him, and picked up his phone from the bedside table. My heart was beating faster than it should have, like I was about to uncover something I wasn't ready to see. For a moment, I just held the phone in my hand, staring at it like it might somehow warn me before I opened it. I had never gone through his phone before, not in all the years we had been together, because I never had a reason to. There had never been doubt, never been suspicion, never been anything that made me question him. But now, everything felt different, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I unlocked the phone slowly, half expecting something to stop me, but nothing did. The screen lit up quietly, and for a second, everything looked completely normal. I started with the messages, scrolling through conversations that looked exactly as they should. Work-related chats, casual exchanges, nothing unusual or suspicious. There were no hidden contacts, no strange names, no late-night conversations that didn't make sense. Everything was clean, almost too clean, like it had been carefully arranged to look normal. That thought made my chest tighten, because it didn't feel like honesty, it felt like control. I moved to his call history next, but it told the same story. Nothing out of place, nothing that explained what I had been feeling. And that's when but then I kept scrolling, slowly at first, then faster as something inside me started to shift. The more I scrolled, the less familiar everything became, until I reached a point where nothing made sense anymore. There were photos I had never seen before, places I didn't recognize, moments that didn't include me at all. In every single one, he was there, standing alone or posing casually. smiling like everything in his life was exactly the way it should be. My hands started shaking as I looked closer, trying to understand what I was seeing. These weren't old photos. They weren't from before we met. They were recent, taken at times when I knew exactly where he was supposed to be. And yet, there he was, somewhere else entirely, living moments I had never been part of. I zoomed into one of the pictures. I had my fingers trembling slightly as I tried to focus on the details. The background didn't matter. The location didn't matter. Nothing in the image mattered except him. And that's when I saw it. Something so small I almost missed it at first. A scar on his wrist, faint but clearly visible, exactly like the one my husband had. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, because for a moment it felt like confirmation, like proof that everything was normal after all. But then I looked again, closer this time, and that's when the realization hit me. The scar was on the wrong hand. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. My husband's scar had always been on his left hand. I remembered it clearly, the story behind it, the way it healed over time. But this one was on the right hand, placed in a way that didn't match anything I knew to be true. I felt a cold wave spread through my body as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. Because in that moment, there were no more explanations left, no more excuses I could hide behind. If you're still watching this, it means you would have noticed something was wrong too. So, tell me in the comments, at what exact moment would you have started getting suspicious? I dropped the phone onto the bed, my hands suddenly feeling too weak to hold it. My chest tightened as I tried to breathe normally, but nothing about that moment felt normal anymore. Every thought I had been pushing away came rushing back at once, louder and clearer than before. The voice, the habits, the memory he got wrong, all of it started to connect in a way I couldn't ignore. And the more I thought about it, the more one terrifying possibility began to take shape in my mind. I turned slowly toward him again, watching him sleep as if I was seeing him for the first time. He looked exactly the same, every detail perfectly in place, every feature exactly as it should be. But now, instead of comfort, it filled me with fear. Because if everything looked right, but nothing felt right, then the truth had to be something far worse than I was ready to accept. And as I lay there in the silence, one question kept repeating itself in my mind, growing louder with every passing second. If this wasn't my husband, then who was he? And where was the man I had spent 12 years of my life with? I didn't sleep at all that night, not even for a moment. I stayed awake, watching him, thinking, trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense. And every time he moved slightly in his sleep, my heart jumped, like I was afraid he might wake up and catch me staring. I didn't know what I would say if he did, didn't know how I would explain what I had seen or what I was feeling. Because how do you tell someone you think they're not who they say they are without sounding completely insane? Morning came slowly, and when he finally woke up, everything about him seemed normal again. He stretched, yawned, smiled at me like he always did, like nothing had changed. And for a brief moment, I almost believed it. I almost convinced myself that everything from the night before had been in my head, that I had imagined it all. But then I remembered the photos, the scar, the way he answered that question, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. That was the moment I decided I needed more than just suspicion. I needed certainty. So I did the only thing I could think of, something that felt wrong but necessary at the same time. I decided to follow him, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know where he really went when he left the house every day. I couldn't rely on what he said anymore, couldn't trust the routine I had believed in for years. If there was something I was missing, I needed to see it for myself. And as I watched him get ready that morning, moving through his usual routine like nothing had changed, I knew this was my only chance to find the truth. I waited until he left the house before making a move, standing by the window just long enough to see his car disappear down the street. My heart was beating faster than it should have, not from panic, but from something deeper, something that felt like I was stepping into a reality I wasn't prepared for. I gave it a few minutes, trying to act normal, even though nothing felt normal anymore. Then I grabbed my keys and followed. I kept a safe distance, careful not to draw attention. watching every turn he made like it mattered more than anything else. Because in that moment, it did. If you enjoy stories that make you question everything you think is normal, make sure you're subscribed, because some stories only get darker from here. At first, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. The usual route, the familiar roads, the predictable stops at traffic lights I had seen him take countless times before. For a brief second, I almost felt relief, like maybe this would all lead to nothing. Like maybe I had let my thoughts run too far ahead of reality. But then something changed. Instead of turning toward his office, he kept driving straight, passing the road he should have taken without hesitation, without even slowing down. That was the moment my chest tightened again, because now I knew for sure that whatever was happening, it wasn't in my head. I followed him further than I ever had before, into parts of the city I didn't recognize, where the streets felt quieter and less familiar. The buildings became more spaced out, the traffic lighter, until eventually he turned into a narrow road that looked almost abandoned. I slowed down, keeping my distance, watching as his car came to a stop in front of a building that didn't look like anything I had seen before. It wasn't a workplace, not a home, and not anything that had a clear purpose. It was just there, plain and silent, with no signs, no names, nothing to explain why it existed. He got out of the car and walked toward the entrance without hesitation, like he had done it many times before. There was no key card, no interaction with anyone, just a simple push of the door as he stepped inside. I stayed in my car watching, trying to decide what to do next. Every instinct told me to leave, to turn around and pretend I had never followed him, but something stronger kept me there. I needed to know what was inside that building, what could possibly explain everything I had seen so far. So I stayed, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting. Time passed slower than I expected, each minute stretching longer than the last as I sat there, watching nothing happen. The silence around me felt heavy, like the entire place was holding something back. I checked the time, then checked it again, barely believing how long I had been sitting there. And just when I started to think maybe I had made a mistake, maybe this would lead to nothing, the door finally opened. My breath caught as someone stepped out, and for a second, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. It was him. The same face, the same body, the same exact features I had spent 12 years memorizing. He walked out casually, just like the man I had followed inside, like there was nothing unusual about it at all. But the problem was simple and impossible at the same time. The man I had followed had not come back out. There had been no gap, no moment where I looked away, no chance for me to miss it. And yet now, there was another version of him standing outside that building, like he had been there the entire time. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My first instinct was denial, to convince myself that it wasn't him, that I was mistaken, that there was some explanation I hadn't considered yet. But the longer I looked, the harder it became to deny it. Every detail matched perfectly, from the way he adjusted his sleeves to the way he moved as he walked. It wasn't similar, it wasn't close, it was exact. And that was what made it impossible to ignore. The second man walked toward a different car, one I hadn't noticed before, and got in without looking around. I watched as he drove off, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How could there be two of them? Which one had I been living with? And more importantly, how long had this been happening without me noticing? That last question hit me harder than anything else, because it meant this wasn't new. This wasn't something that had just started. This had been happening long enough for it to feel normal to them. I sat there in silence, staring at the building like it might suddenly explain everything if I waited long enough, but it didn't. It just stood there, quiet and empty, like it had nothing to hide. And yet, I knew better, because whatever was inside that place had just shown me something I couldn't unsee. The life I thought I understood, the man I thought I knew, all of it had just been pulled apart in a way I couldn't fix. And the worst part was, I still didn't know the truth. I should have left right then. I should have driven away, gone somewhere safe, somewhere far from whatever was happening. But I didn't, because leaving without answers felt worse than staying. So instead, I waited a little longer, watching that door, hoping for something else, something that might make sense of what I had already seen. But nothing else happened. No one came out, no one went in, just silence. And eventually, I realized that whatever I was going to find, it wasn't going to be here. The drive back home felt longer than it should have, like the distance had stretched somehow, without me noticing. My thoughts wouldn't settle, each question leading to another, each possibility worse than the last. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I already knew one thing for sure. The man I had been living with was part of something I didn't understand. It's something that was bigger than anything I had imagined. And whether I was ready or not, I was already involved in it. I walked into the house slowly, every step feeling heavier than usual, like I was entering a place that wasn't mine anymore. The silence inside felt different now, less comforting, more watchful, like the walls themselves knew something I didn't. I sat down for a moment, trying to steady myself, trying to decide what to do next. Because whatever came next, I knew it wouldn't be simple, it wouldn't be easy, and it definitely wouldn't be safe. And as I sat there waiting, one thought kept repeating in my mind, louder than everything else. If there were two of them, then how many more could there be? And which one was going to walk through that door next? If this gave you chills, don't forget to like the video. It really helps this story reach more people. I don't remember how long I sat there before I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, but the moment I did, everything inside me went still. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, my heart beating faster, my breathing becoming shallow as I turned toward the door. For a brief second, I considered leaving, just walking out and never coming back, but my legs refused to move. I needed to see him again, needed to confirm that what I had seen earlier was real. And as the front door slowly opened, I realized there was no going back anymore. He walked in like nothing had happened, like this was just another normal day. His movements were calm, controlled, exactly the way they always had been. He closed the door behind him, placed his keys down in the same spot, and looked at me with that familiar expression I had seen 1,000 times before. If I hadn't followed him, if I hadn't seen what I saw, I might have believed everything was still normal. But now, every small detail felt different. Like I was watching a performance instead of a person. And the worst part was, he was playing his role perfectly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable, like something was waiting to break. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me in a way that felt deeper than usual, like he was trying to read something I hadn't said yet. That was when I realized something I hadn't considered before. If I had noticed changes in him, then there was a chance he had noticed something in me too. And suddenly, the fear shifted. It wasn't just about what I knew anymore. It was about what he knew. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my movement steady even though everything inside me felt unsteady. My mind was racing with different ways to approach this. Different questions I could ask, but none of them felt right. Because how do you confront someone when you don't even understand what they are? How do you ask a question when you're not sure the answer will make sense? I took a step closer, watching him carefully, searching for something in his expression that might give me an answer before I even spoke. And then, without planning it, without thinking it through, the question came out. I asked him who he was, and the moment the words left my mouth, I felt something shift in the room. It wasn't visible. It wasn't something I could point to, but it was there. Like a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. He didn't react immediately, didn't look confused or defensive the way I expected. Instead, he just stared at me, his expression calm, almost curious, like he had been waiting for me to ask that question. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced before. It wasn't empty, it was full, filled with something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. I held my breath without realizing it, waiting for him to respond, hoping for something that would bring me back to reality. But what came next didn't do that. Instead, it pushed me further away from anything that felt normal, anything that made sense. He smiled, slowly, deliberately, like he was acknowledging something instead of denying it. And that smile was enough to confirm everything I had been afraid of. Because it wasn't the smile of someone confused or surprised. It was the smile of someone who already knew the truth. My heart dropped as I realized what that meant. because it meant this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't something I had imagined. It was real, and he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words themselves felt heavier than anything I had heard before. He said I wasn't supposed to notice so early, and for a moment, I didn't fully understand what that meant. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was something planned, something controlled. And the most terrifying part wasn't that it was happening, it was that it had been happening, without me realizing it. I took a step back without thinking, my body reacting to something my mind was still trying to process. My hands felt cold, my chest tight, like the air around me had suddenly become heavier. I wanted to ask more questions, needed to understand what was happening, but the words wouldn't come out the way I wanted them to, because every answer I imagined felt worse than the last, every possibility more terrifying than the one before it. I asked him where my husband was, and for the first time since the conversation started, something in his expression shifted slightly. It wasn't a big change, just a small tilt of his head, a pause that felt different from the ones I had noticed before. He didn't answer immediately, and that silence felt more dangerous than anything he could have said, because it made me realize that whatever the answer was, it wasn't something I was ready to hear. When he finally responded, his voice remained calm, but there was something else beneath it, something I couldn't quite place. He said my husband was safe, at least for now, and those last two words stayed with me in a way nothing else had. For now. It wasn't reassurance. It wasn't comfort. It was a warning. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood what it really meant. It meant nothing about this situation was permanent. Nothing was guaranteed. And whatever was happening was still in progress. I felt my legs weaken slightly as I tried to steady myself, my mind struggling to keep up with everything that was unfolding. Questions filled my head faster than I could ask them, each one more urgent than the last. Who were they? Why were they doing this? How long had it been happening? Yes, and the most important question of all, what was going to happen to me now that I knew? Because if I had discovered something I wasn't supposed to know, then there was a chance I wasn't supposed to still be here. He took a small step closer, and instinctively I stepped back again, creating distance between us without even thinking about it. That small movement felt like it carried more meaning than anything we had said so far, because it wasn't just fear, it was recognition. I knew now, without any doubt, that the man standing in front of me was not the person I had built my life with. And no matter how much he looked like him, no matter how much he sounded like him, that truth couldn't be undone. And as I stood there, trying to understand what came next, one realization settled in my mind with a clarity I couldn't ignore. Whatever this was, whatever they were doing, I had already gone too far to pretend I didn't know. And that meant one thing. I wasn't just part of this situation anymore. I was a problem that needed to be handled. I couldn't stop looking at him, even though every instinct in me was telling me to look away. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, calm and composed, like none of this was unusual to him. It wasn't just what he had said, it was how easily he said it, like he had expected this moment from the beginning. That realization made everything feel heavier, because it meant I wasn't discovering something unexpected. I was walking into something that had already been prepared. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt like I had been guided to this point without even realizing it. I asked him what he meant, that even though a part of me already knew the answer, wouldn't make things better. He didn't rush to respond, didn't try to explain everything at once, and that silence felt intentional. It was like he was deciding how much I was allowed to know, how much I could handle before everything fell apart completely. When he finally spoke, his words were slow and measured, like each one had been chosen carefully. He said that people notice patterns more than they realize, and that most of the time, they ignore them. But sometimes, someone pays attention long enough for those patterns to break. His explanation didn't feel like an answer. It felt like something designed to keep me thinking without understanding. And that only made the fear grow stronger, because it meant the truth wasn't something simple. I pressed further, asking him directly what he was, because at that point, I didn't care how impossible the question sounded. I needed something real, something clear. But instead of giving me a direct answer, he stepped slightly to the side, like he was creating space between us for a reason I didn't understand yet. He told me that what I was seeing wasn't just about one person, and that was the moment everything inside me tightened again. Because I had already seen enough to know that much was true. I had seen the second version of him, the identical face, the same movements, the same presence. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel more real, more solid, like it couldn't be dismissed as confusion or coincidence anymore. He said there were others, not just him, not just the one I had followed, but more than I could imagine. And that was when the situation stopped feeling personal and started feeling something else entirely. I asked him why, my voice barely steady enough to hold the question together. Why replace someone? Why take a life that already existed instead of creating a new one? And for the first time, his expression changed in a way that felt almost human, not emotional, not sympathetic, but something close to understanding. He said it wasn't about replacing, not in the way I was thinking. It was about continuation, about maintaining something without interruption. And that explanation only made things worse because it meant this wasn't random, it was systematic. My mind struggled to keep up with what he was saying, trying to fit his words into something that made sense. But every time I thought I was close, something else would shift. That something else would make it more complicated. I asked him how long this had been happening, and his answer came faster this time, like he didn't need to think about it. He said longer than I would be comfortable knowing, and that answer stayed with me in a way that made my stomach turn, because it meant this wasn't new, it wasn't recent, it had been happening for a long time. I thought about every moment we had shared, every memory, every conversation, and suddenly none of it felt stable anymore. I didn't know which parts were real and which parts weren't. I didn't know if the man I had loved for 12 years had always been the same person, or if he had been replaced long before I ever noticed. That thought hit me harder than anything else, because it meant I might have missed the moment everything changed. And if I had missed it once, how many other things had I missed without realizing it? I asked him again where my husband was, because that was the only question that still mattered. Everything else felt secondary compared to that. This time, he didn't avoid the question completely, but his answer still wasn't what I needed. He said my husband was exactly where he needed to be. And that answer felt like another layer of uncertainty instead of clarity, because it didn't tell me if he was alive, if he was safe, or if I would ever see him again. It just told me that whatever had happened to him was intentional. The room felt smaller as the conversation continued, like the space around me was closing in with every word. I could feel my thoughts becoming more frantic, my need for answers turning into something closer to desperation. And yet, he remained calm, steady, and unaffected by everything that was happening. That contrast made the situation even more unsettling because it showed how unbalanced everything had become. I was reacting, trying to understand, trying to hold on to something real, while he stood there like none of it required effort. Then he said something that made everything stop again, something that shifted the focus in a way I hadn't expected. He said the real problem wasn't what I had discovered, it was what I was going to do with it. And that was the moment I realized the situation had changed again. This wasn't just about answers anymore, it was about consequences. Because now that I knew, now that I had seen enough to understand that something was wrong, there was no neutral position left for me to stand in. I felt a wave of fear move through me as I thought about what that meant. If I stayed, I would be part of something I didn't understand, something I couldn't control. But if I left, if I tried to expose it or run from it, there was no guarantee I would be allowed to. Because whatever this was, it was organized, controlled, and clearly capable of staying hidden for a long time. That meant they had ways of handling situations like this, ways of dealing with people who notice too much. He took another small step forward, and this time, I didn't move back immediately. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I realized something important in that moment. Running without understanding would only make me more vulnerable. If I was going to survive this, if I was going to have any chance of finding out what happened to my husband, I needed to stay long enough to learn more. That decision didn't make me feel stronger. It didn't make the fear go away, but it gave me something I hadn't had before, a direction. And as I stood there, facing him, trying to steady my breathing and focus my thoughts, one realization settled in deeper than everything else. Whatever this was, whatever they were doing, it wasn't over yet, not for them, and definitely not for me. If this gave you chills, don't forget to like the video. It really helps this story reach more people. I didn't move, even though every part of me wanted to. Fear has a way of pushing you to run, to escape before things get worse, but something about that moment held me in place. Maybe it was the need for answers, or maybe it was the realization that leaving wouldn't make this disappear. Whatever the reason, I stayed where I was, looking at him, trying to understand what came next. It's because for the first time since everything started, I knew this wasn't just something happening around me. It was something I was already inside, whether I wanted to be or not. He watched me carefully, like he was waiting for a decision I hadn't fully made yet. There was no pressure in his expression, no urgency, just quiet patience. That made everything feel even more controlled, like this moment was expected, like it had happened before in ways I couldn't see. I realized then that whatever this was, it followed a pattern, one I had unknowingly stepped into. And if that was true, then my reaction, my fear, even my questions might not be as new to him as they felt to me. I asked him what would happen if I chose to leave, and for the first time, there was a pause that felt different from the others. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't uncertainty. It was something closer to calculation. When he answered, his voice remained calm, but the weight behind his words felt heavier than anything he had said before. He told me leaving wouldn't change what I already knew, and that knowledge itself was the real problem. That answer stayed with me because it meant the danger wasn't in what I did next. It was in the fact that I had already seen too much. The room felt quieter than before, like even the air had settled into something more serious. I could feel my thoughts slowing down, not because I was calm, but because I was starting to understand the situation in a different way. This wasn't about a single choice. It wasn't about staying or leaving in a simple sense. It was about being part of something that didn't allow easy exits. And the more I thought about it, and the clearer it became that this had never been about just my husband. It was something larger, something structured, something that had been working quietly without being noticed. I asked him one last question, not because I expected a clear answer, but because I needed something to hold on to before everything changed completely. I asked him if I would ever see my husband again, and the silence that followed felt longer than any we had shared before. He didn't look away, didn't avoid the question, but he didn't answer it directly either. Instead, he said that some things are easier to accept when you stop expecting them to return, and that was the moment I understood what he wasn't saying. Something inside me shifted then, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, final way that felt permanent. The questions were still there. I said the fear hadn't disappeared, but there was a new awareness beneath it all. I wasn't just dealing with something unknown, I was dealing with something that didn't follow the rules I was used to, and that meant I couldn't rely on the same expectations, the same logic, the same sense of control I had before. Whatever came next, it would require something different from me. He stepped back slightly, creating space between us again, and that small movement felt like the end of something I couldn't fully define. Not the end of the situation, but the end of the moment where I still had the illusion of choice. Because now, whether I stayed or left, whether I asked more questions or stayed silent, I was already part of this. That realization didn't bring clarity, but it brought something else, something heavier and harder to ignore. That night, I didn't leave the house. I didn't call anyone, didn't try to explain what had happened, didn't even try to convince myself that I could escape it. I stayed, not because I felt safe, but because I knew running without understanding would only make things worse. And as the hours passed, the silence of the house felt different, like it was no longer just a place I lived in, but a place that was watching me as much as I was watching it. Days passed after that, but nothing returned to normal. He continued moving through the house like everything was the same, like nothing had changed, but I knew better. Every word he said, every movement he made, carried a weight it didn't have before. And no matter how much I tried to focus on what was in front of me, my mind kept returning to that building, to the second version of him, and to the realization that there were more I hadn't seen. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake and listen to the house, to the small sounds that once felt familiar, but now felt different. Footsteps in the hallway, quiet movements that didn't always match what I expected. And in those moments, I would wonder if I was the only one awake, or if there was something else moving through the same space, something I couldn't see but could still feel. I never got the answers I wanted, not completely. Some questions remained, not because they couldn't be asked, but because the answers wouldn't change anything. And maybe that was the point. Maybe this was never about understanding everything, but about realizing that some things exist, whether we're ready for them or not. And even now, I still find myself thinking about that first moment. The one I almost ignored, the slight pause in his voice, the small change in the way he said my name. Because if I had let it go, if I had convinced myself it was nothing, maybe I would still be living in that version of my life where everything made sense. But I didn't. And now I know something I can't unknow. Sometimes when the house is quiet and the night feels heavier than usual, I still get the feeling that I'm being watched. Not in a way that's obvious, not in a way I can prove, but in a way that sits just beneath the surface of everything. And the more I think about it, the more I realize something that I can't escape. I don't know if the man in my house is still the same one who walked in that day, and I don't know if I would even notice if he changed again. If you were in my position, would you stay and find out the truth, or run before it's too late? And be honest, would you have noticed the signs earlier, or ignored them like I almost did?